And now it's time for a Q&A from you, the viewers. And our first question comes in from Tim Vreeland, who's been having some discussions with friends and family in regards to input lag on game controllers. Now, one of the things that we often see when they're marketing a game controller is that it introduces zero lag into the mix. And that is not always the case. We've done a lot of testing on input lag here on the channel. We test it not only with game controllers, but also with monitors, because there's a lot going on, which we're going to get into in a second. Now, what I do to test input lag is I use my iPhone because it has a 240 frames per second slow motion camera. And what I do is I shoot the screen and a button at 240 frames per second, and I count how long it takes for a button push to register on screen. It's not completely scientific, but it gets you close enough to see what some of the variations are. Now, some of the best controllers that I have tested include an 8BitDo wired arcade stick. That one comes in at around 38 milliseconds or so when it's directly connected to my PC on a 144 Hz gaming monitor. On the other end of the spectrum were some of the cheaper Bluetooth game controllers that connect up to Android devices. Some of those we saw taking as much as 120 milliseconds for a button push to register on screen. And I'm finding that if you thought you were really good at a game back in the 80s or 90s and you start playing it now in emulation, the reason why you may not be as good at the game now is that the input lag is just enough that your muscle memory has to get retrained to account for that slight delay. And I think there's a significant issue out here based on how some of the architecture involving game controllers is designed. And I wanted to, first of all, talk about how things used to be. So back in the old days, back when things were better, we had a CRT television and an Atari 2600, for example, all hooked up with analog cables, and there wasn't much in between a game controller button and something happening on screen. In fact, on the old Atari 2600 joystick, for example, every pin was mapped to a controller direction, and when you move the controller up, for example, it would basically close a circuit, and pin 1 here would be pulsing out some electrical signals to the Atari, and your thing would happen on screen without much in between. Now, however, things are much more complicated now that CRTs have gone away and everything is digital from start to finish. So here are some of the factors that go into input lag that I have detected over the years. The first is the speed of the HID chip inside of your controller. So when you push a button on the controller now, that electrical signal is still happening much in the same way it did 40-something years ago on the Atari. But what's happening is that signal goes to a chip inside of the game controller. It converts that signal into a data packet that gets pushed out through USB or over Bluetooth, and that goes back to your host device, which has a host Bluetooth or USB controller. When it gets that signal, it has to decode that packet, and then it's got to do something with it. So there's some lag just right out of the gate with that process. It's no longer a straight electrical signal back to the device. It is a little bit of digital processing going on. And then if you're using something like a USB hub, that introduces another hop that data has to take. So we're broadcasting from the controller to the USB controller inside of the hub. That hub then has to take that packet and pass it along to the computer. This all happens very quickly, but this is an additive thing. Every bit of lag that happens anywhere along this process here will be added to whatever lag came before it. So when you get down to the TV level here, our digital TVs get their signals digitally from a computer or game console. The TV has to process that digital signal and turn it back into an image. And some TVs just do it faster than others. Sometimes you might be at 720p and scaling up to 1080p, or maybe you're going at 1080p to a 4K TV. There are some things that have to happen to get those images looking properly on your television screen, and that adds some overhead and some input lag. Then you've got considerations like the refresh rate for your PC. Is it at 60 Hertz or is it at 30? How does that impact things? If you have VSync on, that might impact when that game controller output gets detected and displayed on screen. Maybe it has to wait until the next frame for that to appear. I found that my 144 Hz monitor delivers better performance than when it's at 60, because there are more frames to display in a second. Now, some TVs have a game mode that you'll want to make sure is on, because if it's off, that will really impact your overall input lag performance. So make sure that game mode is on. And then, of course, you've got things like emulation overhead, because some emulators do introduce some lag on their own, on top of all the other lag that came before it got the signal from the USB or Bluetooth host controller. So there's just so much nowadays going into this, rather than the nearly direct connection we had between the button and the TV screen back in the old days when things were definitely better. So there's really just a lot going on here, and I think it makes some of these really difficult platform games really hard to replicate now. And this is also why it's always best, if you really are into retro gaming, to play those games on original hardware on a CRT television, because you will not have any of this stuff in the way while you're playing that game, and you might actually do a lot better as a result. Remember, these games were designed back then around the fact that there wasn't any of this input lag to deal with, and they are really programmed with that assumption. Today's games are actually being programmed a little differently, and that's going to lead me to my pick of the week this week. So up on GameSpot's YouTube channel is a great video about the hidden details of Dead Cells. Now, if you're not familiar with Dead Cells, it is a great platform hack and slash game that is procedurally generated. So every time you play through, the game is a little bit different. And one of the things that this game is universally praised for is its control scheme. You really feel like you're moving the character around and really have very fine control over how the character jumps and moves around from one scene to the next. But as it turns out, they actually baked in some things to help the player get around a little bit easier. So for example, as you're hopping up platforms like that, occasionally you might jump a little bit too early. And what the developers decided to do was actually create a little bit of a mulligan there. So if you jumped a little bit early, it will actually make your character just jump a little bit further to reach the platform on the other side. They didn't want to take away some of the fun factor, they said. And I think a lot of it might be due to the fact that everyone's experience with input lag is now very different. If I'm on a TV that is introducing 80, 90, 120 milliseconds of input lag, my experience and my enjoyment of the game might be different than somebody who's on one of those 144 hertz gaming monitors with 38 milliseconds of input lag. So as a result, the game kind of accounts for that without the player really knowing it. Now you might say normally, oh, that's making the game too easy, but in this case, it might actually make the game be more universally played, in that it is kind of accounting for what variations in input lag might be out there. And I think it's probably what we're going to be seeing more and more of. Developers have to think about this kind of stuff now when they're putting these games together. And you compare something like this to the new Mega Man game that is on all the modern platforms. That one's a really hard game, and sometimes it's hard because everything has to be precisely timed when you do your jumps. And if that input lag is too high on the device that you're playing on, that's going to have an impact in your overall enjoyment of the game and perhaps its difficulty. It might be easier for somebody on a device with a faster display versus someone on a slower one, and this is just the reality that we're dealing with now. And I would love to see the game industry really look at this problem, both the hardware and the software side, because perhaps there could be some way we can bypass USB and go back to those more direct electrical connections to make these games run just a little bit faster for players. Otherwise, I think maybe it's time to bring back the CRT televisions so some of those twitchy games can still be enjoyed today. Now, I would love to hear from some of you who have more technical experience with the hardware and software side of the games industry. Leave your comments down below in the video description and maybe inform all of us about the things that game developers and game hardware manufacturers have to think about now in relation to this problem, because it really has changed how games are played. And I would love to hear some more about that from people who know more than I do on this topic. So let me know down below.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/S.